Hello, my name is Riley Horn, and this is my history of communication presentation. This is for Introduction to Communications with Professor Cole. So I thought I would start off by talking about what communication is, as this is what the entire presentation is about. So in the textbook, communication is defined as the transactional use of symbols, influenced, guided, and understood in the context of relationships, whether that be familial, romantic, professional, and other relationships that we might have. There are 7 different characteristics of communication. It's symbolic, it requires meaning, it's cultural, it's relational, it involves frames, it's presentational and relational, and it's a transaction. The important thing about communication and trying to understand it is that we experience communication every single day, whether that be through speaking with someone or through silence. And sometimes we don't even understand how important an interaction might be or what we're learning from it, because it just seems so simple. But every time that we communicate with someone or someone communicates with us, we are learning something. So communication is definitely complex, and you can see that through the difficulty in even defining communication, but it's really worth studying and understanding so that we can maybe have less misunderstandings, less arguments in our lives, and it's just overall important to understand communication. So, throughout history, there have been 5 major ages of communication. Even within the last couple decades, communication has evolved. I remember growing up, there were no iPhones, and now a lot of people have iPhones, and that has definitely changed the way that we communicate with each other. And so humans have used different ways to communicate with what was available in that time, like a horn during war in the medieval ages, but now we have phones, and we can send emails and text messages in that way. We don't have to use horns or drums or pigeons. But through this evolution, there have been 5 major stages. There's speech and language, writing, print, electronic mass media, and then the information age. So the age of speech and language, communication didn't replace anything. It merely helped the evolution of our modern day techniques and technologies. And unfortunately, the originations of speech aren't super clear, but I'll definitely talk more about that on my next slide. Today, there are about 3,000 languages. However, there may have been as many as tens of thousands of languages spoken throughout the history of humans. A lot of our languages today did evolve from ancient languages that don't exist anymore or that people don't speak anymore. But out of the 3,000 languages that we have today, only 78 have literature. So here's the question that I was wondering is, when did humans begin speaking? So linguistic experts accepted the laryngeal descent theory for decades, or also they call it LDT. LDT says that when the larynx was developed in modern Homo sapiens, speech was developed, and they believe that was about 200,000 years ago. However, newer thinking proposes that our throat shape and motor control was developed 27 million years ago, so speech was developed then. However, there are some experts who do disagree with this theory, and they believe that when humans split with the Pan genus, which would be closer to 5 to 7 million years ago, whenever they split, that is when they believe that humans started speaking, because they would have needed to communicate with other people due to socializing in larger groups. Some believe that the reason why speech developed was because of our necessity to express our emotions. However, some believe it was to communicate within a group. So, also, I do want to say that there's not that much research that can be done about the beginnings of speech, but hopefully one day we can learn a little bit more. So the next stage is the age of writing. You can see in the pictures cuneiform and cave paintings. People back a long time ago used cave paintings and cuneiform to communicate. So the cave paintings were typically drawings of people and animals, and then cuneiform is one of the oldest forms of writing. A lot of people believe that the Sumerians developed cuneiform. It means wedge-shaped, and it was writing done on clay tablets. Cuneiform was used to record information and to write stories and letters. Then sounds were later added to cuneiform, so bee and leaf, beleaf. Then we have the age of print. Monks began copying text onto papyrus before paper existed, and they wanted to preserve learning. Craftsmen and manuscript copyists also copied text to make sure that books were accessible to people, and a lot more people began to read and write. And then we also have Gutenberg's work during this time. In Germany, around 1438, Johann Gutenberg made a mold to cast letters. He then published the first book in the 1950s, and he published the Gutenberg Bible in 1450s, and 1455 is when he published the Gutenberg Bible. Before newspapers, there were news sheets, and they were like the earliest form of newspapers, and they helped with the spread of information to people, the spread of knowledge. But when newspapers were created, people believe that's when the first form of mass media began. Which brings us to electronic mass media, and this includes radio, newspapers, TV, and the internet. Electronic mass media is important because it helped with making information accessible to a large amount of people, and people could communicate farther. So in the early 1900s, radio was invented, and in 1901, there was the first transatlantic message sent from the U.S. to England. And then in the 19th century, film was created, and theaters began being put everywhere in the West in the 1900s, and this was a huge form of entertainment, and it still exists as a huge form of entertainment for us today. Then we have the information age. The information age is also known as the computer or digital age. This has brought so much greater accessibility to information, and it's very speedy. A lot of people can access the new technology. Because it's so large and accessible, there have to be regulation laws. I know there's some laws about cyberbullying and stuff like that. So the information age is mostly the internet, but that includes the World Wide Web, which we all know and love, email, teleconferencing, telecommuting, and these things have made it so much easier, in my opinion, to communicate with people, and especially during the pandemic, if we didn't have teleconferencing and telecommuting, it would have been so much harder to survive. We had teleconferencing obviously in school, and that was the only way that we could continue going to school during the pandemic. And then telecommuting made it so much more accessible for people to work from home, and it definitely helped us during the pandemic. This is my last slide, and I wanted to touch on why orality or spoken language is so important. So like I was saying earlier in the presentation, only 78 languages today have literature, but experts believe that of all the languages ever spoken, which could be up to tens of thousands, only 106 about have had literature. So, although writing and gestures are important, oral speech is more important, according to Ong. Non-oral communication is important. However, you can't have non-oral communication you can't have non-oral communication without oral communication. He even says that sign language depends on sound, depends on a spoken language. So every language depends on sound, and writing cannot exist without spoken language. Spoken language can exist without writing, but speaking is very important. And so that is the end of my presentation. I really believe that studying communication is really important, and understanding the history of communication is important so that we can understand why we communicate the way that we do and where we can go from here. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation.